Why are there so many Christian denominations? Where did they all come from? Oh, that's easy. I came first and everyone else split from me. No, wait, I came first and everyone else split from me. Okay, it's debatable who really came first, but all the mainstream Christian groups are rooted in the same early church. Catholicism comes from the early church, which was founded by Jesus and the apostles. The early church had one problem, though. It was illegal, at least in the Roman Empire, which is where most Christians lived. But despite being illegal, Christianity kept spreading no matter how much the Romans tried to persecute it, until it eventually took over the whole empire, and then the Roman Empire became a Christian empire, with Rome being the capital of the church. But then the Roman Empire collapsed, at least the half of Rome that has Rome in it. But the church in Rome survived, and it kept its power, so to this day, Roman Catholicism preserves the heritage of the old Christian Roman Empire. Eastern Orthodoxy also comes from the early church and is rooted in imperial Christianity. The difference is, when the Roman Empire split into East and West, and the East was the only half that survived and became the Byzantine Empire, a lot of people thought it was the Byzantines that were actually in charge of the church, not Rome, especially because it became the Byzantine emperors who would call the ecumenical councils, where the most important church decisions were made. And they were still united with the Roman Church, but they disagreed on who was really in charge. So when they had a big disagreement with Rome in the Great Schism, each of them thought they could kick each other out of the church. So Eastern Orthodoxy was the state religion of the Byzantine Empire, until the tragic fall of Constantinople. But to this day, Orthodoxy keeps the heritage of the Byzantine Empire alive. And Orthodoxy is all about preserving the traditions and handing down the faith from generation to generation. Lutherans come directly out of the Protestant Reformation, which is where a bunch of Catholics thought the Catholic Church had gotten more corrupt over time and was abandoning the beliefs of the Bible and the early church. It all started when Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to the door of a church, criticizing things like purgatory, indulgences, and the power of the Pope. Now, he was not trying to start a fight and was not trying to start a new church. He favored a reformation of the church, not a revolution, but he got excommunicated anyway. But wait, a lot of Catholics actually sympathize with Luther, and they side with him over the Pope and do the Reformation anyway. But is he willing to side with them? He's only willing to work with people who agree with his view of the Lord's Supper, which is that the bread and wine are physically the body and blood of Christ. Some people do agree with him, and some people don't, so the Reformation splits into Lutheran and not Lutheran, and the not Lutherans end up being called Reformed. So Reformed Christianity comes from the same Protestant Reformation, but it started out as kind of a union of different groups in different places with no clear leadership, and sometimes they disagreed on things like the Lord's Supper. They all disagreed with Luther's view, but for example, Zwingli, the Swiss reformer, said the bread isn't really the body of Christ in the Lord's Supper, whereas Vermigli, the Italian reformer, says it is the body of Christ for those who have faith. But then John Calvin came along, and his ideas were so influential that they sort of standardized the Reformed tradition. He sided with Vermigli's view of the Lord's Supper and wrote a bunch of stuff on what he believed to be the biblical teaching on various issues. He believed in the sovereignty of God, in predestination, in avoiding idolatry, in spiritual presence in the Lord's Supper, and in infant baptism. And none of these things were new beliefs. They had all existed previously in the Catholic Church. This is why Reformed theology is also called Calvinism, and the Calvinist Reformation spread to many places, which is why you have the Huguenots, the German Reformed, the Hungarian Reformed, the Dutch Reformed, and the Scottish Presbyterians, but we'll talk about them later. Anglicanism comes from the same Protestant Reformation. A lot of people think it started when King Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, but all he really did was cut ties with Rome. He didn't really care what the theology of the Church of England was. It was Thomas Cranmer that was the theological head of the English Reformation, and he wanted the Church of England to embrace the reformed ideas of Calvin and Vermigli. But then the Church of England had a problem that went something like this. I'm the new King of England, and England should be Catholic. No, wait, I'm the new King of England, and England should be Reformed. Wait, I'm the new Queen of England, and England should be Catholic. Wait, I'm the new Queen of England, and England should be Reformed. You get the idea. So after several generations of seesawing between Reformed and Catholic, the Church of England settled on a middle way between the two. And that's why they made some compromises with Catholic teaching, even though they are Protestant, such as having an episcopal structure, which is where the church is run by a hierarchy of bishops. Except Scotland was not on board with this. Presbyterians are just Reformed people from Scotland. The reason they're called Presbyterian is that describes how they run their church government, like a republic, as opposed to Episcopal church government, which runs more like a monarchy. And the Episcopalians in England kept trying to impose their church government structure on the Scottish Presbyterians. Hey, you guys should become Episcopal. No. Well, guess what? The king said so. Well, the king is wrong. It was this spirit of rebelling against the king that actually inspired the American Revolution, which is why the English called it the Presbyterian Revolt. The Anabaptists, which is where Amish and Mennonites are from, came around the same time as the Reformation, but were very different from the Reformation. The Anabaptists were much more of a radical Reformation, or, if you will, a revolution. The Reformation still saw itself as a continuation of the Catholic Church. It still worked with the government and the secular institutions, and they still baptized babies to show that being a Christian is a collective identity as well as an individual identity. But the Anabaptists saw themselves as starting from scratch, not being from the Catholic Church at all. They did not work with any of the institutions, they separated themselves from the secular government, and they did not baptize any babies, because they said being a Christian needs to be a personal and individual choice. So what about, like, Baptists? Are they Anabaptist? Well, it's complicated. Officially, they come from the Church of England when a bunch of preachers split off because they wanted their churches to be independent, but their ideas were the same as a lot of Anabaptist ideas, like not baptizing babies, being skeptical of the institutions and government, and also being skeptical of traditions that were inherited from Catholicism. So I guess you could say Anabaptists are like the dark espresso, but then they were diluted by the water of the Church of England to get regular Baptist coffee. Now, the Congregationalists were like the Baptists in that they wanted their churches to be independent, but unlike the Baptists, they actually held to Reformed theology and baptized babies. But there was so much pressure in England to conform to the mainstream Church of England, so many of the Congregationalists just ran away to America on the Mayflower and became the Pilgrims. So the reason you eat a bunch of turkey every year and have awkward arguments with your family is because a bunch of Calvinists got too Calvinist for the other Calvinists. Methodism was started by John Wesley. By accident, he didn't try to start a new church. He was part of the Church of England, but he thought it had gotten dry, cold, and spiritually dead, and he lived during the First Great Awakening, so he thought it needed a massive revival, and he had a method for encouraging this. He went all over the place with a bunch of other awakening preachers, preaching religious revival and encouraging people to be active in their faith, but this accidentally led to the formation of specifically Methodist churches. The holiness churches come from the Second Great Awakening. They were a bunch of Methodists who got too Methodist for the Methodists. They thought the normal Methodists weren't Methoding hard enough. They wanted people to focus a lot on striving for spiritual growth and avoiding sin. And this holiness movement spread all over the world. In America, you got big denominations like the Church of the Nazarene, and in Nigeria, you got big denominations like the Redeemed Christian Church of God. Now let's talk about Pentecostals. They started in the early 20th century with the Azusa Street Revival, where a bunch of people thought they had the same spiritual gifts that the apostles had, like healings, prophecy, and speaking in tongues. And so, a lot of holiness Christians started methoding even harder, saying that the method needs to include these spiritual gifts. The Coptic Church is one of the Oriental Orthodox churches. Just like the Eastern Orthodox, they're rooted in the early church and in Imperial Christianity, but they split from Imperial Christianity pretty early on over a theological disagreement. The Copts in Egypt had a saint named Saint Cyril of Alexandria who said Jesus is one, not two, and the Council of Ephesus sided with him. But then there was another council that the Copts didn't necessarily agree with. At that council, the Pope in Rome said you had to say Jesus has two natures. And the Copts were like, wait a minute, that contradicts the previous council. No, it doesn't. Yes, it does. No, it doesn't. Yes, it does. So the Coptic Church left Imperial Christianity because they believed the Council of Chalcedon left the true faith, and they had their own pope and stuff. And the Oriental Orthodox churches are all the churches that side with the Coptics on this. You have the Ethiopian Church, the Armenian Church, and the Syriac Church, and generally these were the churches that were not quite rooted in Imperial Christianity. There's the Moravians, who were Protestant before Protestants existed. They were started by this Czech dude named Jan Hus, who was basically the Martin Luther before Martin Luther existed. The Assyrian Church of the East is another one of those early churches that split from Imperial Christianity pretty early on, just like the Oriental Orthodox. The difference between them and the Oriental Orthodox is this. Remember how St. Cyril won that theological debate? Yeah, the Assyrians were the people he won the debate against, because they followed the teachings of a guy named Nestorius. The Restorationists are a recent movement which gave us the Churches of Christ and the Disciples of Christ that really aren't Protestant at all. They tried to just rebuild Christianity from scratch entirely. Because of that, they don't use any creeds or confessions, so they are not rooted in the early church. But although the Christian family tree has many branches, all the branches have the same roots, which is the one message about Jesus.